9 seconds, Betsy. That's how long it took me to realize my whole life was a lie.
The kind of children who don't need a father like you. Step aside, Taemin.
9 seconds. That's how long it took the coldest man in Busan's underworld to forget every rule he'd ever built his life around. It happened over a cup of tea, in a mansion that wasn't even his, in front of a woman he was supposed to be falling for. Hey, wherever you're tuning in from tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and how the weather's been treating you. Because where this story is about to take you, nobody in that room had any idea their whole world was 30 seconds from turning inside out. There's a particular kind of reckoning that doesn't come with warning. It doesn't announce itself. It walks in wearing a maid's apron and sets a teacup down without saying a word, and by the time you understand what's happening, it's already too late to stop it. This is a story about a man who believed control was the same thing as love, and a woman who taught him, the hardest way possible, exactly how wrong he was. Her name was Betsy. This is the story of how a man who once signed her away with a single stroke of a pen ended up on his knees, 5 months later, learning how to warm a bottle to exactly the right temperature for children he didn't know existed. Picture this. A man used to being the most dangerous person in any room, sitting frozen in a leather chair, watching a woman walk past him with a tea tray, recognizing something in the line of her jaw that no stranger could have replicated. That was Kang Tae-min. 30 seconds before the life he thought he understood came apart in his hands. But let me start from the beginning. Tae-min was 34 years old when he divorced Betsy Owusu, and by every account that mattered inside his world, it was the correct decision. The photographs had been convincing. His most trusted advisor had confirmed the timeline himself, in a voice heavy with what looked like genuine regret. And Tae-min was not a man who tolerated hesitation once he believed the truth was in front of him. He signed the papers in his penthouse overlooking the harbor, slid them across the table without raising his voice, and watched the only woman who had ever made him feel like something other than a title walk out of his life without a single word of protest. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't understand for another 9 months, was that Betsy had walked out of that penthouse already carrying 3 lives inside her. Lives she wouldn't confirm until the next morning, in a clinic, alone, with no one's hand to hold. She never told him. She had her reasons, and every one of them was good enough to survive 9 months of silence, 3 jobs, and a body that kept fighting, even when her spirit had every excuse to stop. What she didn't plan for was ending up, 5 months after giving birth, working under an assumed name in the household of the very woman the syndicate elders had handpicked to replace her. She definitely didn't plan for Tae-min walking through that door on an ordinary Tuesday evening, sitting down in a chair like he owned the room, and asking, simply, for tea. To understand what happened in that sitting room, you have to understand who Kang Tae-min was before any of this, and who Betsy was before she ever set foot in Korea. Betsy Owusu grew up in Accra, the daughter of a shipping logistics manager who spent 30 years building relationships with ports across 3 continents. She'd moved to Seoul for graduate work in international trade, fluent in 3 languages before she turned 20, sharp enough that a consulting firm handling legitimate freight contracts for several large Korean conglomerates recruited her before she'd even finished her thesis. She believed in doing things properly. She believed that if you worked hard enough and stayed honest enough, the world eventually rewarded you for it. She wasn't naive about power. She'd grown up around men who wielded it, but she'd never been naive about herself either. She knew her own worth, and she didn't apologize for it. She met Tae-min during a contract negotiation. Neither of them expected to matter beyond the paperwork. He was cold in every meeting, precise, unreadable, the kind of man other executives in the room seemed quietly afraid of, without ever explaining why. But somewhere between the third meeting and the fourth, he'd started asking her questions that had nothing to do with shipping routes. What she thought about honesty, whether she believed people could change, whether she'd ever loved someone enough to forgive something unforgivable. She hadn't known yet that these weren't hypothetical questions to him. They were the questions of a man testing whether the world outside his family's business could hold something real. Tae-min had inherited control of the Kang organization at 26, after his father's sudden death left a vacuum that half a dozen ambitious men were prepared to fill with blood if necessary. He'd survived that first year by becoming exactly what the organization needed: cold, exacting, incapable of being read. By the time he met Betsy, he'd spent 8 years building a reputation so absolute that grown men negotiated with a tremor in their voice just from being in his presence. Marrying a Ghanaian-American consultant with no ties to any syndicate family scandalized the elders in ways Tae-min had never fully appreciated until it was already done. They tolerated it because his word was still law, but the tolerance came with a cost he didn't recognize until much later: a growing current of resentment among the men closest to him. Chief among them, his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Jung Ho-suk, who had stood beside Tae-min since they were teenagers running errands for Tae-min's father. Ho-suk had built his entire position on being indispensable to a hard, controlled version of Tae-min, a softer Tae-min, one who talked about legitimizing operations, about pension funds and shipping insurance rather than territory and fear, about the kind of future Betsy quietly encouraged him to imagine, was a Tae-min who needed Ho-suk less. Betsy never knew any of this while it was happening. She only knew that the man she'd married was, underneath the reputation, someone who pressed his forehead to hers at 2 a.m. and told her she was the only thing in his life he'd never tried to control. She believed him. She built a life around believing him, learned to fold dumplings his mother's exact way, sat beside his mother during holidays with a patience that earned her something rare in that family: genuine affection instead of polite tolerance. She thought that meant something. She didn't yet know that somewhere in Ho-suk's basement office, a file was already being built, one photograph and one falsified timestamp at a time, engineered to convince Tae-min that everything he believed about his own marriage was a lie. By the time he confronted her with it, the case against her was airtight enough that Betsy barely got through 2 sentences of denial before she understood he'd already made his decision. She'd learned, in the years since, that some men don't listen because they can't. They listen because listening requires admitting they might be wrong, and Tae-min had spent his entire adult life being a man who was never wrong. She signed the papers he slid across the table. She walked out of that penthouse with nothing but a suitcase and a phone number she was already planning to change. She didn't know yet that she was carrying 3 children. She found out the next morning, alone, in a clinic waiting room, 4 words from a doctor, rearranging every plan she'd ever made for her life. The 4 words were simple: "You're carrying triplets." Betsy sat in that clinic chair for 11 minutes after the doctor left the room, staring at an ultrasound printout that didn't yet look like anything except 3 small, stubborn heartbeats on a gray screen, and did the math on her own life the way she'd once done math on shipping contracts, clearly, coldly, without letting herself feel any of it yet, because feeling it meant panicking, and panicking wasn't a resource she could afford. She had 3 options, and she turned each one over with the same discipline that had made her good at her job. She could tell Taemin. If she told him, she understood exactly what would follow. A man like Taemin did not simply become a father. He became a fortress, and his children would become the thing every rival organization in the country would eventually try to use against him. She'd sat through enough dinners with syndicate wives to know what that life looked like from the inside. Bodyguards at birthday parties, tutors vetted by security details, childhoods measured out behind bulletproof glass. She loved him, or she had. She would not hand her children a life built on that kind of fear. Not for a man who hadn't given her the basic decency of 5 minutes to explain herself before signing her out of his life. She could go to her family in Accra, but her father's business had quiet dealings with shipping partners who were not entirely separate from Taemin's world, and she understood that any address connected to her name would eventually surface if the wrong person went looking. Her family would be walking into danger they'd never signed up for. Or she could disappear completely, change her name, sever every connection, survive on nothing but her own resourcefulness, until she'd built something stable enough to protect 3 children from a war she wanted no part of. She chose the 3rd option, and she chose it the same night, closing her old bank account before dawn, the one account Taemin's legal team hadn't already frozen out of what she now understood had never been trust but simple bureaucratic oversight. What followed was not recovery. It was survival, engineered day by day with a discipline that would have impressed even Taemin had he ever known about it. Betsy moved into a 1-room apartment in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions because everyone there had their own reasons for staying quiet. She worked as a translator for a small import firm by day, took in freelance contract review work by night, and stacked what little savings she had into an account under a name that didn't exist on any document connecting her to the Kang family. She was 7 months pregnant with 3 children when her landlord found her sitting on her kitchen floor one evening, too exhausted to stand, eating rice out of the pot because she hadn't had the energy to find a bowl. He didn't say anything about it. He simply adjusted her rent due date by a week, the closest thing to kindness the outside world offered her in those months. She gave birth at 35 weeks, an emergency delivery in a public hospital, alone, no one's hand to hold through it. 3 names already chosen months in advance, because she'd refused to let herself go into that room without knowing exactly who she was bringing into the world. 2 girls and a boy. When the nurses asked about the father, she told them he'd died, in the way that mattered to her, the man she'd loved actually had. I want to ask you something, and I mean this honestly. If you were Betsy, carrying 3 children from a man who destroyed your marriage over a lie he never gave you the chance to disprove, would you have told him, even knowing what it might cost your children to grow up inside his world? Or would you have done exactly what she did and disappeared to protect them the only way you knew how? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. She chose silence, and she chose it again every single day for the next 5 months, through 3 exhausting jobs, through nights with no sleep, and mornings with no support, until a staffing agency offered her something she couldn't afford to turn down, a live-in domestic position at a private estate in Busan, generous pay, private quarters big enough for a small family. She didn't know, when she accepted the position, exactly whose household she'd be stepping into. By the time she found out, she'd already moved her children in. She'd already built a fragile, functioning life behind the walls of the estate, belonging to the woman the Kang family elders had chosen as Taemin's next wife, and she made the only choice that made sense to a woman with 3 infants and nowhere else to go. She stayed. For 5 months, Betsy Owusu became someone else entirely. She went by Grace Nikemderim on the household roster, a small deviation from her own middle name that felt safer than inventing something from nothing. She pulled her braids back into a tight, practical knot every morning, wore the plain black uniform without complaint, and taught herself to move through Yuna Cho's mansion the way she imagined a woman with no history would move. Quiet, efficient, unremarkable. It worked for 5 months. It worked because nobody expected the maid pouring tea in the sitting room to be the erased first wife of the man drinking it. Then Taemin walked through the door on a Tuesday evening, sat in the largest chair in the room like he'd already decided it belonged to him, and asked for tea. Betsy heard the request from the kitchen hallway and felt something cold drop through her chest before she'd even registered why. She recognized the voice before she saw the face. 5 months of careful, disciplined survival nearly came apart in the 3 seconds it took her to pick up the tray and decide that turning back now would be far more dangerous than walking forward. She kept her head slightly bowed as she entered. She'd rehearsed this exact posture in her mind more times than she wanted to admit. A version of herself small enough and quiet enough to pass beneath the notice of a man who read every room he entered, like a battlefield. It didn't work. She felt his attention land on her the moment she set the tray down, and though she never once let her eyes rise to meet his, she felt him studying her wrists, her collarbone, the line of her jaw, with the specific, deliberate focus of a man assembling a case against his own instincts. She'd forgotten, in 5 months of hiding, that Taemin noticed everything. It was the thing that had made him terrifying to his enemies, and, once, made her feel entirely safe beside him. She poured the tea using her right hand, ginger and honey, the exact ratio she used to make for him during the 2 years they'd shared a small apartment before his father's death, changed everything about their lives. She hadn't thought about the ratio in months. Her hands simply remembered it, the way hands remember things minds try hard to forget. "Will there be anything else, ma'am?" she asked Yuna, her voice pitched soft and entirely professional, directed at anyone except the man sitting 3 feet away from her. Yuna waved her off without looking up from whatever story she was telling about a gallery opening in Seoul. Betsy turned to leave. She made it 4 steps before Taemin spoke. "Who made this tea?" His voice was too controlled. Betsy recognized that particular flatness, the sound of a man forcing calm over something enormous moving underneath it. "The new maid," Yuna answered, distracted. "Why? Is something wrong with it?" There was a long pause before Taemin answered, long enough that Betsy, still facing the doorway, felt every second of it pressing against the back of her neck. "No," he said, "no reason." It was a lie, and both of them, in different corners of that room, understood it was a lie for entirely different reasons. Betsy escaped to the kitchen hallway and stood with both hands braced against the counter, breathing in the kind of controlled, measured way she'd taught herself during 3 exhausting jobs and 1 exhausting pregnancy. She told herself it was a coincidence that a man like Taemin drank tea in 100 houses and had simply been reminded of something. She told herself this for exactly as long as it took her to hear his footsteps approaching the East Wing corridor 20 minutes later, far from where any guest of Yuna's had any business wandering. She intercepted him 3 meters from the nursery door. "Sir," she said, her voice level. professional, betraying nothing. The guest areas are back through the main hall. May I show you the way? Taemin turned slowly. In his hand was a small knitted sock, pale yellow, small enough to fit a foot that hadn't yet learned to stand. He must have found it on the floor near the door. Betsy felt her pulse climb into her throat. "Do I know you?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. It was a test, and she understood exactly what kind. "I don't believe so, sir," she said. "I'm new to the household. You pour with the exact same measurements someone I used to know did. Ginger, honey, specific. It's a common preparation, sir. Nothing unusual about it." He studied her for 3 long seconds. The same unreadable focus she remembered from every negotiation she'd ever watched him conduct, looking for the crack in her composure, the way he looked for weaknesses in every deal across every table. "What's your name?" "Grace," she said, without hesitation. He held her gaze a moment longer, then handed her the sock without another word, and turned back toward the sitting room. But something in his shoulders had changed, a rigidity that hadn't been there when he'd walked into that mansion an hour earlier. Betsy stood alone in the hallway, clutching a sock that belonged to a daughter he didn't know he had, and understood, with a clarity that terrified her more than anything else that night, that the wall she'd spent 5 months building had just developed its first crack. And Kang Taemin was not a man who left cracks unexamined. Taemin did not sleep that night. He sat in his private office overlooking the harbor, the small yellow sock resting on the desk in front of him, like evidence at a crime scene he hadn't yet decided how to prosecute. By 7 the next morning, he had Ho-suk's junior analyst, a quiet, careful man named Park Jun-ho, pulling the full staff roster for the Cho estate. Employment records, background checks, every person who had worked in that house in the last 6 months. The file came back by noon. 7 staff members, gardener, cook, driver, 2 cleaners, and 1 live-in domestic worker named Grace and Kemderim, hired through an agency 3 months prior, background clean, almost suspiciously clean for a woman with no prior employment history in Korea at all. Taemin stared at the attached photograph for a long time. Hair pulled back tight, neutral expression, the kind of ID photo that was designed to be forgettable. But he wasn't looking at what the photo was designed to show him. He was looking at the small, faint scar just above her left eyebrow, the one she'd gotten falling off a bicycle as a child in Accra, the one she'd told him about on their 3rd date, tracing it with his thumb months later and telling her it made her look like she'd survived something, and she'd laughed and said, "I did." It was a very aggressive bicycle. He pulled up an old photograph from an anniversary dinner 2 years earlier, one he'd told himself he'd deleted, but had actually just archived, unable to fully let go of it, even in the depths of his anger. He placed the 2 images side by side on his screen. Same scar, same distance between the eyes, same jaw. He sat in that office for a long time without moving, and something inside him, the part of him that had spent 9 months believing he was the wronged party in his own marriage, began to quietly, methodically fall apart. He requested one more thing before the day ended. The original surveillance file Ho-suk had presented to him the night of the divorce. The photographs and hotel records that had convinced him his wife was unfaithful. It had been archived under Ho-suk's personal seal, a detail Taemin had never questioned until this exact moment. He cracked the encryption himself, a skill he rarely used and rarely admitted to having. The metadata told a different story than the photographs had. The timestamps had been altered by 11 minutes to align with a fabricated hotel booking. The booking itself had been made from an IP address, traced directly to Ho-suk's own administrative office, and the man Betsy had allegedly met that night, a mid-level associate named Choi Sung-min, had been transferred to Daegu 4 days before the supposed meeting ever took place. He hadn't even been in the city. Taemin sat in the dark of his office for a long time, and the world didn't collapse the way he expected it to. It simply rearranged itself, quietly and completely, the way a floor rearranges itself into a ceiling once you realize you've been upside down the entire time. He scrolled to an old photo album on his phone, one he'd archived rather than deleted, the same folder he'd been unable to fully erase, no matter how thoroughly he'd tried to erase everything else about her. Betsy laughing on a hiking trail outside Seoul. Betsy asleep in the passenger seat on the drive back from his mother's house. Betsy holding up a persimmon she'd picked herself, grinning at the camera, telling him, "Don't you dare send this to anyone," and him promising, "It's just for me." He closed the phone. He had destroyed his marriage over evidence his own most trusted advisor had manufactured. He had thrown away the only woman who had ever looked past his title and seen the man underneath it. And somewhere in the past 5 months, that woman had given birth to children he knew nothing about, alone, while he sat in a penthouse, convinced he was the one who had been wronged. He did not explode. He did not call Ho-suk. He did not raise his voice or break anything in that office. He straightened his jacket, closed the file, and began, methodically, the way he approached everything in his life, to plan. He arranged the meeting through Yuna, framing it as a staff appreciation dinner, a gesture Korean etiquette all but required Betsy to attend, given her position in the household. Refusing an invitation from your employer's guest of honor would have been its own kind of confession. Betsy came dressed not in her uniform but in a modest dark green dress Yuna had insisted the staff wear for the occasion, and for the first time in 5 months, Taemin saw something close to the woman he'd married, rather than the invisible presence she'd trained herself to become. She moved through the dinner with quiet grace, thanked the other servers, used both hands to receive her glass, the way his own mother had once taught her, and did not look at him once. His mother. The thought landed harder than he expected. His mother had loved Betsy, had wept when the divorce was finalized, had refused to attend the signing, had worn white for a week afterward. Not the white of celebration, but the white of mourning, something that shouldn't have died. And Taemin had told her Betsy was unfaithful. He had watched his mother's face collapse, not into anger, but into the specific grief of a parent watching her child prove her worst fears about him correct. He had used his own mother's heartbreak as fuel to justify the ruin he was building. He hadn't called his mother since. He didn't know how to say the words. "You were right about her, and I destroyed the truth to spare myself an ounce of doubt, and the cost of being right is 3 grandchildren you don't know exist." When the dinner ended and the staff were escorted toward the service entrance, Taemin intercepted Betsy at the garden gate, out of earshot of anyone else. "I know," he said. "No context, no explanation needed." Betsy's step faltered, the first uncontrolled movement he'd seen from her all evening. "I don't know what you're talking about. I know Grace doesn't exist. I know about the East Wing, and I'm starting to understand exactly what I did to you." She turned to face him fully, and what he saw in her expression wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep kind that comes from fighting a war alone for longer than anyone should have to. "Understanding costs you nothing, Taemin," she said quietly. "It's free. It always was." "Then tell me what costs something. Leaving me alone. That's what costs something." Leave me and my children alone." She walked away from him, and for the first time in his adult life, a woman walked away from Kang Tae-min, and he felt it not as an insult to his authority, but as a wound he had entirely earned. But leaving her alone was a luxury he no longer had, because 12 floors below his own office, in a records room he'd forgotten still existed, Ho-suk had just learned that his boss was pulling files on the Cho estate. Ho-suk was not a foolish man. He understood immediately what it meant. He understood that a domesticated Tae-min, one distracted by a family instead of consumed entirely by the organization's growth, was a diminished asset to a man like Ho-suk, whose entire value depended on Tae-min staying hard, isolated, and easily steered. The marriage had made Tae-min soft once already. Talk of legitimate shipping insurance, of pension funds, of a slower, safer future. Ho-suk had ended that softness once. With a single fabricated file, he made 2 calls that night. The first confirmed, through a contact on Yuna's household staff, that there were, in fact, 3 infants living quietly in the East Wing. The second went to a family court attorney, willing to ask, hypothetically, how quickly emergency custody could be arranged for children with an unstable, undocumented mother and no established paternity. 72 hours, with the right judge. Ho-suk's plan was simple and brutal. Expose the children publicly. Frame Betsy as an unfit, undocumented worker hiding inside a household connected to organized crime. Trigger a custody crisis that would consume Tae-min entirely, reasserting Ho-suk's own control over an organization that functioned best, in his estimation, when its leader had nothing left to lose but power. And if that failed, there was a second option, the one Ho-suk considered his insurance. Let the rival families know that Kang Tae-min had 3 unprotected heirs. He gave himself 1 week. What he didn't know was that Betsy had spent 5 months building her own quiet network. Women who had survived powerful men and learned, the hard way, to watch each other's backs from the margins nobody paid attention to. They had already noticed him asking questions. This time, when Tae-min came, she let him in before he even asked. He arrived at the service entrance 2 nights later. No driver waiting outside. No suit. Just a plain dark coat with rain still clinging to the shoulders because he'd walked the last stretch from the gate instead of pulling up to the door. His hands were empty. No phone. No file. No leverage disguised as a conversation. "I'm not here as Yuna's guest," he said. "And I'm not here as anyone's employer. I'm here as the man who failed you. And I'd like, if you'll let me, to see them." Betsy studied him for a long moment, searching for the angle, the strategy, the thing men like him always carried into a room, even when they claimed they hadn't. But what she found instead frightened her more than any threat could have. He looked exactly the way she remembered feeling in that hospital room in Ansan, alone, terrified, trying anyway. She stepped aside. The nursery was small, clean, warm in the way that only came from presence rather than heating systems. 3 cribs lined the far wall, a mobile of folded paper cranes turning slowly above them, each one folded by her own hands during the 3rd trimester, on nights when sleep had abandoned her entirely and her fingers had needed something to do besides shake. Tae-min approached the first crib. Inside, a boy slept with his fist curled near his mouth. The second held a girl breathing in the deep, even rhythm of complete peace. In the third, another girl, the smallest of the 3, with a tuft of dark curling hair and a face that carried, unmistakably, the shape of his own mother's smile. His jaw tightened once, a small involuntary movement. Betsy had spent 3 years learning to read that exact motion. She didn't miss it now. Their names? His voice barely held together. The boy is Kwame. The eldest girl is Efwa. The youngest is Ajoa. Owusu names, not Kang. He understood immediately, and he didn't argue, because he understood he had no right to. Are they healthy? They're strong, Betsy said. Stronger than I ever expected to be some days. I read the real file, he said, forcing the words out one at a time. I know Hosuk fabricated the photographs. I know the hotel records were planted. And the man I accused you of meeting was never even in the city that night. I know I destroyed my marriage because I trusted the wrong voice over the woman who never once lied to me. And I know that if I'd given you 5 minutes that night, instead of a pen and 3 pages of legal paper, none of this would have happened. He turned to face her fully. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I'm asking you to let me earn the right to try. Betsy looked at him for a long, measured, devastating moment, weighing 5 months of exhaustion against the man standing in front of her with empty hands and rain still on his shoulders. Earning starts tomorrow at 6, she said finally. That's when Kwame needs his first feed. Efua sleeps through it, but Ajoy wakes up screaming and won't stop until she's walked. And the formula has to be exactly 37 degrees, or all 3 of them reject it. She handed him a burp cloth. Welcome to my world, Kang Tae-min. No warmth in her voice, no forgiveness offered. Just a door cracked open exactly wide enough for one man to prove he could become something other than what he'd already been. Tae-min dismantled Hosuk exactly the way he did everything else, without raising his voice, without theater, and without ever mentioning Betsy's name in the room where it happened. He called a closed session of the organization's inner council, 12 men who ran the operational arms of everything the Kang family touched. He laid the evidence out in order, calm and methodical. The altered timestamps, the fabricated hotel booking, the IP trace back to Hosuk's own administrative terminal, the transfer memo, proving the man in the photographs had been 400 kilometers away the entire night in question. He framed it purely as a breach of operational trust. Personal pain had no currency in that room, and Tae-min understood that structural failure did. You manipulated intelligence to influence a personal decision belonging to the head of this organization, he said. That is a violation of the Command Trust Clause you helped write yourself. Your access is revoked. Your holdings are frozen pending audit. Your seat at this table no longer exists. Hosuk rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and paused at the door with the particular stillness of a man who has already started calculating his next move rather than mourning his last one. She'll break you, he said quietly. She already did once. Tae-min didn't look up from the documents in front of him. No, he said, you did. She just survived it. But Hosuk's removal from the table didn't erase what he'd already set in motion 3 days earlier. He had sent the children's existence, Betsy's location, the estate's address, to 2 rival families before the meeting had even been scheduled, an insurance policy against exactly the outcome that had just occurred. By the time Tae-min learned this, the information was already circulating in hands that did not negotiate and did not wait for permission. He had 10 days before Hosuk's parting move matured into something neither he nor Betsy could contain. He spent every one of them in that small nursery at 5:47 each morning, 13 minutes early, carrying a pharmacy bag with formula and diapers in the exact size and brand Betsy had left written on a note by the door. He fumbled his first bottle. He startled when Efua spit up on his shoulder, He sat frozen the first time Kwame wrapped a fist around his index finger, with a grip that made something in his chest crack open in a way 12 years of running an empire never had. On the fourth night, security intercepted two men attempting to scout the estate's perimeter from a rented car half a kilometer down the hill, men connected to one of the families Ho-sok had reached out to. Taemin didn't wait for a second attempt. He convened every remaining loyal captain in the organization, moved Betsy and the children to a secured property under names even his own accountants couldn't trace, and personally delivered, in person, to both rival families, a message that required no interpreter. Any further approach toward his children would be treated as a declaration of war against the entire Kang organization, not a negotiation. The threats stopped within the week, not because the rival families suddenly respected boundaries, but because they understood, finally and completely, that the version of Taemin, willing to burn everything down to protect 3 infants, was far more dangerous than the cold, controlled man they'd spent years learning to negotiate with. On the 10th night, exactly as promised, Taemin stood in the doorway of the nursery, exhausted, unshaven, a burp cloth still draped over one shoulder from the evening feed, and told Betsy the wall was built. The threat was contained. The organization no longer had a seat for Ho-sok, and no rival family had a path to her children that didn't run through him first. Betsy studied him for a long moment, the same measuring look she'd given him the first night she let him hold a bottle. 10 days, she said. You kept the pattern. I told you I would. You told me a lot of things once, she said quietly. This is the first time you've shown me instead. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was, for the first time in 5 months, something steadier than fear. The months that followed didn't move the way fairy tales do. There was no single moment where everything broken between them was suddenly whole again. Betsy didn't hand Taemin forgiveness the way she'd once handed him tea, freely and without hesitation. She made him earn every inch of trust the same way she'd survived the last 9 months, one verified pattern at a time. He showed up. Every morning at 5:47, without fail, whether or not there was danger left to manage. He learned Ajoa's specific cry, the one that meant she needed walking rather than feeding. He sat through Kwame's fevers at 2 in the morning, without calling a single member of his staff to handle it for him. He called his mother, finally, and told her everything, the fabrication, the divorce, the children she didn't know she had. She wept on the phone for a long time, and then she asked, in a voice thick with something between grief and joy, when she could meet her grandchildren. Ho-sok's removal from the organization triggered exactly the kind of internal restructuring Taemin had spent years avoiding, a shift away from the ruthless, expansionist ambitions that had once defined the Kang name, toward the slower, legitimate ventures he'd once discussed with Betsy in their first apartment, when neither of them had any idea how far either of them would fall before finding their way back. Betsy never returned to being Taemin's wife in name overnight. For a long time, she kept her own apartment, her own name restored, her own independence intact, and Taemin never once pushed her toward more than she was ready to offer. He simply kept showing up, kept building the pattern, kept proving with actions rather than promises that the man standing in her doorway with a burp cloth over his shoulder was who he actually intended to be, not a performance staged for an audience that no longer existed. A year after that Tuesday evening in Yuna Cho's sitting room, Kwame, Efwa, and Ajoa took their first unsteady steps on the same afternoon, one after another, in a garden that belonged, this time, entirely to their mother. Taemin sat on the grass watching all three of them with the same stillness his own men had once mistaken for control, though everyone in that garden understood now that it had never really been control at all. It had simply been a man, finally, learning what mattered. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you think Betsy was right to give him those 10 days. Like this video if Kwame, Ifua, and Adjoa deserved every bit of the family they got in the end. Share it with someone who needs a story about second chances earned rather than given, and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next story.